Record on this computer. All right, everybody, welcome back. I've got a very exciting episode in store for you today. I'm sitting here with Dr. John Vervaeke. John, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Eric, for inviting me.
So you have been on my radar for a while after I was introduced through Twitter to the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series and subsequently inhaled all of that at a very rapid pace because it was a synthesis of, quite frankly, A, so much, but B, synthesized so well and so clearly that, you know, I really feel it should be somewhere in the high school curriculum to look at. You know, with that, I think part of the reason I really wanted to have this conversation today is A, just introduce more people to you, to your ideas, and to your thinking, because it gives, I think most importantly, it gives mental frameworks and it gives shared language so that you can start digging in instead of just saying, I notice a lot of people in this space saying, you know, things are wrong either inside or outside, and I kind of don't know why, but I know it's off a little bit. And having this language now just gives you such strong tools to approach it. So before we dive in, because we have a fair list to cover, could you just give a bit of your background, how you got to doing what you're doing today?
Oh, sure. First of all, Eric, thank you for what you just said. I want you to know that, and your listeners to know that it means a great deal to me. I, I aspire to truly mean what I'm about to say, which is above and beyond being right about any particular claim or any particular theory, providing people with, conceptual vocabulary and a theoretical grammar so that they can articulate and express and reflect and communicate. That is my primary goal in everything I'm doing. So thank you for saying that. It's much appreciated. About me, I don't know where would be the appropriate thing to begin. I was brought up in a religious framework, fundamentalist Christianity, that with only over a period of about 25 years have I come into what I consider a properly ambivalent attitude towards it. In that initially, of course, my attitude was, because it was a very traumatizing kind of religious framework, my attitude towards it was very antagonistic, aggressive, atheistic, rejection, because of course it had hurt me. But your mother religion is like your mother tongue. You may learn another language, but you won't live in it the way you live in your mother tongue, right? It's woven into the very fabric of your coming into being. And so that left in me, especially in the figure of Jesus of Nazareth, it left in me a kind of hunger for the depth, or at least what I perceive to be a depth of life and a depth of connectivity and a depth of meaning that I would properly say I didn't experience in that religion, but that had been portended for me. And so I carried that hunger around, and it sort of led me to, as I said, to atheism and a deep kind of nihilism, which is where in my sort of early adulthood, I encountered in a very inarticulate way, and I'm sure lots of people have this kind of encounter, and perhaps that's some of their resonance with my work. But I encountered what you might call the meaning crisis individually in a very intense but cohate and searing but almost inexpressible manner. And so I was wrestling with that, and and I was reading some Jung. I would have been introduced to Jung by the fiction of Robertson Davies, and I was reading some Hermann Hesse. I'd been introduced to Buddhism that way, and then I got into university and I met Plato and the figure of Socrates, and this had just a titanic effect on me. because it gave me the sense of a palpable sense of moving towards that kind of connection and meaning that I had felt portended in my religious heritage, but had actually not met. And I saw in the figure of Socrates, an individual that, of course, I didn't associate with that trauma because it was a new figure for me. So I immediately took up this project of the cultivation of wisdom, in the sloppy way you do when you're an undergraduate, and that's not a criticism. That's how it should be done, and that's how it's inevitably done. But what happened to me is very quickly that the figure of Socrates, the aspiration to transcendence and to depth of meaning, and the cultivation of wisdom fall off the academic table, and you don't talk about that anymore. You get all worried about epistemology and skepticism and all this very technical and argumentation. And I came to value academic philosophy for its own sake, because I found the tools it was affording me, and the stance of the meta-scientific critique and the meta-cultural critique and the meta-historical critique. I found that all very valuable. But because of the way I'd gotten into it, I also was deeply dissatisfied. And so I undertook to try and find another avenue for the cultivation of wisdom and deep connection and deep meaning. And so I took up a bunch of, I guess sort of inspired by Hermann Hesse, I got involved with Eastern wisdom practices, and I was very fortunate to be taught an ecology of practices. I was taught Vipassana meditation, medic contemplation, Tai Chi Chuan, Qi Kung as this integrated ecology. That's the birthplace of the idea of an ecology of practices. And I just found the dynamics of that powerful and transformative in ways I wasn't recognizing it. I had powerful moments where other people were recognizing changes in me before I recognized it, and I saw this. And so two sort of streams were then going on in my life, this academic stream, and I finished my MA in philosophy, and then the dissatisfaction just got too great. And by that time, a new discipline had opened up that incorporated philosophy, but also did lots of psychology and artificial intelligence and linguistics and anthropology, and that was cognitive science. So I went back and did a specialist degree in cognitive science to get into that, while continuing on in all of these, embodiment practices that within the ecology of practices. And then about the time I was done my cognitive science degree, I started teaching. Now, because I had already done philosophy, I didn't have to do any philosophy for my cog sci degree. So I ended up doing more psychology than people do for their psychology degree.
Awesome.
Which meant I was fully trained for doing psychology as well. So I started teaching some psychology courses and an introductory cog sci course. And at about that time, cog sci had come to a place, and psychology, where you could start talking about some of the things that were like wisdom and mindfulness and self-transcendence and mystical experience. And suddenly, these two things that had been separate came together for me. And then a good friend and colleague of mine, and somebody whose work I highly recommend, Evan Thompson, was supposed to teach a course on Buddhism and cog sci, and then he couldn't do it, and so he recommended me to teach it. And I saw that I could bring these two streams together because that's what the course was about, Buddhism and cog sci, bringing these two streams together. And then I thought I could bring those together to address this problem that I've been wrestling on personally, this meaning crisis. And so I did the course, and then that eventually evolved over time into the series. And so this ongoing dialogue between these three figures within my psyche, Socrates, and ultimately the way of dialogos, which hopefully we'll talk about a bit today, the Buddha and the way of mindfulness, mystical experience, self-transcendence. And then I was able, through them, to return back to Jesus, and also the importance of dialogos, because he has he is also a midwife of others. And there again, the return to agape as a fundamental way of life. And that I could see that because I could understand it from the Buddhist notion of compassion. And so all these things came together with me with this new emerging and increasingly powerful form of cognitive science. And so that's how I got where I am. That's how I am the person I am, and that is why I'm engaged in the project that I'm engaged in.
Wow. So if that wasn't enough of a trailer to start watching The Meaning Crisis, I don't know what is, because that is fantastic. I was actually talking to um, someone last week who came into kind of Eastern philosophy and Buddhism from physics. And it seems that there seems to be a natural gravity there, whether you're studying psychology in the mind or physics in reality. There always seems to be this drift in those who study it deeply towards Buddhism and Eastern philosophy. Again, there's something just about the understanding and right relationship of what is fully that just seems to happen quite naturally. And to have you articulate some of those concepts was just beautiful. And it's actually, I think, one of the places we're going to start here. We spoke earlier about the fact that when I was thinking of what I wanted to give people with this, it was mostly three things. One, I wanted to give them something they could walk out with right after listening to this, basically changed, or something they could put into practice or at least see differently. The second was some increased language, a new vocabulary that they can orient themselves with. And the third is that I really want to elucidate and dig into the religion that's not a religion here, the stealing the culture, and what moving forward with that actually looks like in practice. But to give an example, one of the things, this is actually something you speak about in the series, where there are some things that come into your life that just jump out at you. They shine differently. For me this was almost like an alarm. Like, it was like, this is extremely important, dig into this more. And it was one of your lectures on dukkha, the
Right.
Buddhist concept of dukkha, and how that leads into what is known as reciprocal narrowing. Um, that is, I think, those two concepts. I think is one thing we could give people that would shift their life dramatically right now. Uh, I don't know if you need much more of a foundation than that, but could we start there? Talking about what
Sure.
that is and what reciprocal narrowing implies?
Sure. But do you want me to talk a bit about the general background of dukkha and then use that as a way of articulating? Because I see reciprocal narrowing as a component of dukkha.
Yeah.
Maybe if I gave that framework, that would be helpful overall.
Yeah, that'd be ideal.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the Buddhist notion of dukkha is often translated as suffering, and we tend to hear this incorrectly. We tend to hear this almost as a synonym for pain. That's similar to the way the word mad now for us has become a synonym for angry. Whereas, of course, mad means insanity, and one of the things that can make you insane, right, is anger, right?
Yeah.
So in a similar way, we should see suffering, and the way you can know this is the case, by the way, is by paying attention to the metaphors that the Buddha uses to describe dukkha. They're largely metaphors of imprisonment, entrapment, not being able to move forward, stuckness. And so you should see suffering more as a loss of agency rather than simply pain. Now, pain can rob you of agency, but many other things can rob you of agency. And so you have to really broaden your notion of dukkha. And what we want to ask is, what are the general principles by which people lose agency? The Buddha said is, no matter where you dip, he said, like the ocean, no matter where you dip into it, you'll taste salt. No matter where you dip into his teaching, you'll taste freedom, which is the restoration of agency. So how do we lose agency? Well, the idea of dukkha is, for me, what the Buddha is doing is he's articulating a kind of perennial problem that human beings fall prey to, which is the very machinery that makes us intelligently adaptive makes us perpetually susceptible to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And as a cognitive scientist, I study this deeply. And so I'm deeply convinced of the truth of this fundamental claim. That's dukkha. Dukkha isn't sort of like an external thing, like a devil that sort of sometimes corrupts you. It's that the very machinery that you depend upon for your agency is also the same machinery that can subject you to a loss of agency through self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And so what happens in dukkha is that the adaptive machinery, see, you have to understand that this adaptive machinery works in a dynamical fashion. It's not just, it's not a, like, so when you're coming into a scene, your attention is self-organizing, right? You can zoom into details, you can zoom out to the whole picture, you can step back into your own mind, you can move forward to try and get to the depths of my mind, and all you're doing is tweaking that because it's largely a very complex self-organizing process, right? Now, what that means is that self-organizational nature, the way your cognition dynamically feeds back on itself, also means that you can get into what I call parasitic processing, in which some event happens to you, and then that self-organizing process, people will know immediately what I'm talking about. We even have this language. We talk about things like, I get into an anxiety spiral, right? I start to ruminate, or my mind starts to race, or I find that I'm getting, right? And so your mind, this parasitic processing, the self-organizing nature of your adaptive cognition can also capture you like a parasite. And the fact that it's adaptive means it's really hard for you to try and get rid of it, because as you try and intervene and stop when you're ruminating, well, I shouldn't be thinking that way. That doesn't do anything because it just reorganizes.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you have that, I'm going to try and put three pieces together, so please be patient with me. So you've got this parasitic processing. The other thing people can do is they can be sort of deeply confused about that dynamic relationship between them and the environment, right? So what do I mean by that? This is a notion from Erich Fromm. And this is the notion that we have existential modes. I mean, that's a broader notion from existentialism. That means whenever I come into any situation, and this is a part of that adaptive machinery I was just talking about, right? That self-organizing adaptive machinery. In a dynamical fashion, when I come into any situation, I assume a particular identity and I assign a bunch of identities. So right now, I am the professor and you are, right, the interviewer, which of course you're much more than that. And I hope I'm much more than just a professor, but I'm assuming an identity, I'm assigning an identity, and I'm doing that to sculpt the space that I'm working in. Is that okay? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Now, what Fromm talked about is when we do that process of co-identification, we can do it around different kinds of needs. We can organize that mode around the having needs. These are needs that are met by having things like having water, having oxygen, having food. And what I want there is I want to assume the role of a manipulator and a controller. So I need to control and manipulate water, or I'm dead. And I need to assign categorical identities. Oh, that's water. Oh, that's also water, right? And so things have their categorical identity so that I can easily manipulate them. I can easily replace them. Well, I can't use that water. Oh, that water over there will do, right? And so the having mode is great. It's this control and manipulation in terms of things, categorical identity. Buber calls it an I-it relationship. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But you also have needs that are met not by having and controlling. These are needs that are met by becoming, by developing. Fromm calls them your being needs because they're met by you being a certain way. Like I need to be mature. I need to be wiser. I need to be in love. And there, I'm not trying to control and manipulate things. I'm trying to do something else. I'm trying to enter into right relationship with things, right relationship. And so when I am with this woman who I'm deeply in love with, I don't relate to her categorically and in a manipulative fashion. I don't say, I'm with you because you remind me of all other women, and therefore you're easily replaceable if I need to replace you. And I can control and manipulate you and consume you as I will. Now that's a disaster. And I'm never going to be in love. To be in love means to not approach this person I it, but approach them I thou. Now what we can do is we can get modally confused. We can get modally confused. And what do I mean by that? We can try to satisfy our being needs, but within the having modes. So instead of being mature, we have a car. Instead of being in love, we have sex, right? Instead of being wise, we have lots of nifty propositions we can assert. And that modal confusion will keep us forever spiritually hungry. We will be frustrated because we're not meeting the being needs. Okay, so let's say we're modally confused. And then within, and you notice how that's a form of parasitic processing. It's adaptive self-organization that's coupling me to the world in a way that is deeply self-deceptive, self-destructive, but I'm not aware of. So I'm caught up in this. That leads me to the third component, reciprocal narrowing. What's happening in reciprocal narrowing is, right, the parasitic processing and the modal confusion. I'm assigning and assuming identities in a way that the following thing is occurring. And this is a notion taken from Mark Lewis's ideas of what's happening in addiction. So let's talk about addiction first. Let's say I take the alcohol, and the alcohol removes some of the suffering and distress, right? And so it's temporarily alleviating. But it's actually, it's a very self-deceptive thing to do because it actually is impairing me, right? And so my cognitive flexibility goes down. I can't solve as many problems. And so the options for me in the world goes down, the world narrows. And then that's more threatening to me, right? Notice my freedom is going away. Notice my freedom is going away. The world is threatening to me. And oh no, so now I'm distressed. So I rely on the alcohol a little bit more and I get narrowed a little bit more, right? And that's alleviating because I don't notice, oh, but now the world is narrower. And you see what's happening? The world and my agency are reciprocally narrowing until eventually the world can be no other than it is, and I can be no other than I am. And that is addiction. And that is the complete loss of freedom. So if you have, right, parasitic processing working within modal confusion that brings about a reciprocal narrowing that sucks away and robs all of your life, that's dukkha. And this is not because of some strange or bizarre influence. It's because your cognition is inherently self-organizing. The very processes that are making you adaptively intelligent are also subjecting you to self-deception. They are subjecting you to modal confusion, and they are subjecting you to reciprocal narrowing, and you get locked into dukkha. But here's the point. And I said this to Mark in person, because he's a friend of mine, good friend actually, good colleague. If reciprocal narrowing is possible, then so is reciprocal opening. And if I can be modally confused, I can be modally awake. I can wake up and remember how to be in the being mode as I reciprocally open my identity and the identity of the world. And as I do that, I can become more and more aware of my parasitic processing. I can interactive dynamical system that can counteract all of that machinery and reorient it towards a more life-enhancing way of being. That's wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the ecology of practices I was talking about earlier. And so wisdom and a deeper connectedness to oneself and the world and each other, it's possible. And that wisdom could be comprehensive enough that one was reliably no longer totally confused, reliably capable of dealing with parasitic processing, reliably capable of getting into a flowing connection with the world and other people. That would be enlightenment, I would argue. At least that's one way of understanding enlightenment.
Yeah. Yeah. I've also actually recently, I just heard you use basically extended flow state also as a label you could use for reciprocal opening.
Yes.
Yeah, that is just, it's so extremely powerful because for a few things, there are a number of ways that's extremely powerful. One is that it seems like in common culture, we most people know the term downward spiral if
Yeah,
you said it to them, and almost everyone has some sort of addict in their head when they hear that. But if you then, propose upward spiral, that term is
yeah.
very rarely spoken, and it's like, well, one implies the other. If it's possible to get stuck on a roller coaster going down, it's possible to get stuck on one going up as well.
Pretty much. And the thing is, our culture. I mean, I agree with Arthur Verse Lewis, whose work I recommend. That um, the cultural grammar of spirituality in the West is Neoplatonism, and Neoplatonism had a term for this, which it took from Plato, which is anagoge, right?
Yeah.
And this is the ascent out of the cave, and this was a pervasive notion within our wisdom tradition. The journey of the mind to God in Saint Bonaventure, the Neoplatonic Christianity had it as well. But with the loss of that tradition, and I am not doing some sort of crypto proselytizing for Christianity here. That is not what I am doing. I'm going to say that again. That's not what I'm doing. I'm also not trying to dismiss Christianity. I hope that I'm dialogically in right relationship with people who are cultivating wisdom and enlightenment in Christianity. I want to throw no obstacle in their way, but I am not doing that. But what I'm saying is, when we lost that tradition, that wisdom tradition, and those wisdom institutions, we don't carry around in our mind the model of the monk the way, as you said, we carry around the model of the adept. And our
Yeah.
culture doesn't give us that, except literature, right? So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's extremely important. Again, just having these frames can shift so much. And it's also why, I think a very unfair criticism that's often brought up for addicts is there's often this offhand like, oh yeah, well, why don't they just do it differently?
Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like, it's not that simple. To your point, it's not static. It's not this like bug in the system. It's as much as you can work against it, it can work against you. And that
exactly.
becomes the hardest, literally like the hardest thing to do. Like you see this in some movies or cartoons where the hero has to face the dark duplicate of themselves who is
Yes,
matched in all the skills. It's basically like that. It's like as
yes,
strong
exactly.
as strong as you are, it is against you. And so it's not as simple as like, yeah, well, you should just snap your fingers. And again, even that frame, I think if we could take that culturally and approach that to individuals with mental illness or addiction or anything like that, even that shifts the momentum in such a way that makes it
Yeah,
extremely gives it.
that's why I think Mark's work is so important. That's
Yeah.
why I think Mark's work is so important. The way he's reframing the notion of addiction, not as a disease, but as an embodied, embedded, inactive cycle of learning, that is, I think, really centrally important. I can't recommend his work enough. I think that's really important. I mean, Mark has done so much good work, but if he's remembered for anything, and this comes at the culmination of his career, so that's good for him. But if he's remembered for anything, I hope people remember him for that, and take note of that. Here's the thing I want to say to you, Eric. I mean, so what people like Socrates and the Buddha are saying to us is, the difference between us and the addict is only one of degree, not of kind. We are also entrapped in multiple ways, and I'm including myself. I have no privileged position here. We are also entrapped in ways that we are not aware of. We're only indirectly aware of them in how we suffer. And this will allow me to circle back. That pervasive sense you have in the meaning crisis that something is just not right, and it's gnawing away at everything. That's your indication that you're in something deeply analogous to like the reciprocal self-world narrowing of the addict.
Yeah. And that, this is why the first noble truth is all life is suffering, right? It's like you are constantly threatened by this. It
Yes.
lurks in each moment, waiting for the cascade to begin. And I'm glad you. Yeah,
Well,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. I just want to say one thing. The comprehensiveness of this that you put your finger on is really important. I just want to flag this for people because there is a tendency in our culture to try to respond to this in a way that seems correct. It seems even spiritual to people, but it's deeply misleading, right? And this is the idea that there is some aspect of their psyche that is the safe place from dukkha. Oh, well, but my gut or my intuition. No, my heart. No, my will. No, my intellect. No, my X. And if you, right, any attempt to deify any aspect of the psyche as the place that is the safe harbor from all of the tempest of dukkha is a fundamental mistake, right? It is only a, that's why the Eightfold Path is offered, or where you get all of the whole project around Socrates and the Neoplatonic tradition. You have, that's why, and this is to give you a foreshadowing segue, that's why you need something as comprehensive as a religion to deal with this.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a, what would you call it? That was an underhand pitch. That was a setup right there. And we are certainly building up to knock that out of the park. But there's some other foundations I want to lay as we lead up to this, because again, I think we are going to make the.
I'm just going off camera for a sec because I realize my power's not plugged in.
Good catch. Well,
there we go.
This leads quite nicely into the next kind of term I wanted to bring up for people, because it seems like dukkha is one of these, which is, you use the term perennial problems that humans face a lot. And I notice this in my own life where, sometimes my friends and I will talk and, it's just like, we'll give an answer to a problem that someone's facing. And it's like, well, why are we just discovering this now? Why did it take me into my late 20s to figure this out? And it's like, well, it shouldn't have. People wrote this down a long time ago. We've just lost the practices. We've lost the ideas. We've lost the scripture that actually afforded those answers much earlier. But so can we give an overview of, and I would argue, maybe you would say something differently, that dukkha and reciprocal narrowing are one of the perennial problems faced by humanity. Are there any, can you list some oths, or just what
there are lots. Yeah, and I think your notion of the scriptures, I mean, one way of recapturing, I mean, and Jordan Peterson brought, I mean, I have a very complex relation with Jordan Peterson. He's a colleague and a friendly colleague, and he supports my work. And I think there's a lot of insight in him, but I also have criticisms of his work. But I do think one of the things he did that was of great value was to reawaken people via Jung. He should have also done Corbin as well, but via Jung to the importance of myth, because I think one of the things that myth does for us is it gives us a dramatic, and for reasons we'll talk about later, we need a dramatic and not a merely propositional presentation of these perennial problems. So for example, for every good hero myth, which is the perennial problem of self-transcendence and going through having to face very serious frame breaking and loss in order to afford that kind of growth. There's also a counterbalancing myth of hubris and wait, remember that you're mortal, you'll never be a god, and that doesn't mean that you'll keep progressing towards it. No, you'll always be in your very bones immortal, you'll always be threatened by dukkha, etc. So I think myth is an important thing to remember. So if you look at myth and you look at your sacred scriptures, you can see a lot of perennial problems that come up a lot. And so let's take a myth and people won't even recognize it as a myth, but it is, and it's myth in the sense I'm using it. Shakespeare's Hamlet. Like why do people keep reading about this Danish guy, right? From like the 17th century? Like who cares? Well, because this is a perennial problem. Human beings are beset with, they're gifted by and beset by being self-conscious. And that means if you look at Hamlet, he towers above the people around him, and Shakespeare's using him as an exemplar of this human capacity, for we can rise above our impulses. Unlike many other animals, we are not merely what Frankfurt calls wantons. We don't just, because if I just give in to every impulse, my impulses are contradictory, right? They undermine each other, right? I want to look good and be sexually attractive, but I want the chocolate cake and right, and all that sort of impulsivity, right? And so we can, and this is Bellman's point. I have this capacity of and it's the capacity that mindfulness trains, right? I can step back and look at my own perspective, and we'll talk about later why that requires. Notice how that's already another kind of knowing, perspectival knowing, and we'll come into that, I hope. But I can step back and look at my perspective, and you can say, well, I'm not. I don't want to, and I can actually. This has to do with the logistics of the psyche. I won't give much of my resources and my energy to this impulse right now, and I'll try and redirect towards this impulse. And we can do all that, and thank God we can, because we would be sort of monstrous if we couldn't. But the problem with that self-consciousness, that ability to step back and reflect, is it disconnects us from that machinery. Because, like, when I'm thirsty, and I'm thirsty kind of impulsively, I'm not aware of my thirst. I'm aware through my thirst of everything, right? I'm seeing the world thirstily. But when I step back and look at my thirst, the perspective from which I'm looking at my thirst is not one of thirst. It's perhaps one of curiosity, or perhaps one of frustration, right? But it's a different motivation. And so I'm now actually disconnected from the motivational energy of thirst. I'm no longer seeking for water. Like, you know what I can do with that curiosity? I can step back and look at that. And now I'm no longer curious about my thirst, right? And I can, right? And so I can get caught up, right, in this perspective that completely disconnects me from my motivational machinery. So this is Hamlet's tragedy, right? He keeps thinking and reflecting on his reflecting and about it, and people are dying around him and going insane around him, and there's this tragedy building around him, right? And so our self-consciousness and there's a perennial problem of how do we deal with that, and that interacts with other, like I mentioned it. We are self-conscious of our death in our mortality in a way that other animals aren't. How do we deal with that? There's perennial problems around absurdity. My ability to self-transcend means I can rise above myself till I get to this cosmic perspective. And now it seems like from that cosmic perspective, all of the minutiae of my own motivation and concerns seem so insignificant, so trivial, life seems absurd. And this, of course, is something developed very well in the work of Camus. I'm reading The Plague right now because of COVID and reacquainting with Camus. So we face perennial problems of absurdity. We face perennial problems of the reflectiveness gap caused by our self-consciousness. We reflect, because we are perspectival, we face perennial problems of egocentrism and narcissism. Because we face perennial problems, like you said, around dukkha, around self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, modal confusion, reciprocal narrowing. We face perennial problems of how do I want to say it? There's a family of problems, loneliness or culture shock or future shock, in which we feel like, even again in Hamlet, like the time is out of joint. We feel in the bones of our psyche, we feel that we don't belong, we don't fit in, we're not at one with the environment. We feel homeless, and that's a perennial problem, a sense of a sort of spiritual domicile. This is not an exhaustive list, but does this give you a good sense of what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
there's a sense of how myth is a place to look, like Hamlet, for where these perennial problems are being played out.
Yeah. Well, I think the way it's come up for me is due to your human nature, due to the fact that you are a self-aware human, there's a host. And when you just went off on that list, to me, it was like a hydra. It was just like, holy shit, like I can address one and three others come up. And
yes.
And it was, it seems fundamentally that the problems concern your right relationship to yourself, to others, and to the world,
Exactly, exactly,
right?
exactly.
And again, we get to this. This is why it loops back to myth, and this is why I think Jordan Peterson has grown a little bit, which is that is, for the most part, outside of the domain of science. It doesn't
Yes,
matter that I know you exist. That tells me nothing about how I should relate to you, and
yes,
whether I should feel threatened, should I feel happy, like all of that. And when that's taken, when that confusion of how to relate to something applies to yourself, other people, and everything around you, you end up in no man's land. You end
yes,
up in just this void of what the fuck is going on, like, and it creates this. That's why I think you get things like the rise in mental health crisis, you get the
yep,
rise in nihilism, you just get this what on earth. And I think to the crux of some of your work is when these perennial problems reach a critical mass, because we've lost the ways of knowing, the actual practices that address them, we end up in something like the meaning crisis.
yes, exactly. That was beautifully said. You should have done some of my series. That was really well done. I mean, what you just said, Eric, is exactly the case. That for historical reasons and forces that are still at work, we have we have lost the practices, the ecology of practices, the communities, um, for wisdom, because that's the name I would give to that knowing how
Yeah.
and knowing through a transformation how to get into right relationship with yourself, with each other, in the world. We've lost that in a profound way, um, and that means that we don't even have a like you said, we don't know where we are. We don't have a worldview that homes that pursuit of wisdom and legitimates it and valorizes it and justifies it to us and inspires us to aspire to it. We don't have a worldview that does any of that for us. So when we are beset by the perennial problems and we turn for wisdom, we have nowhere to turn. So when the
Yep.
perennial problems are basically unleashed because we have no homing worldview that homes an ecology of practices that will allow us to deal with that monster, then that is the meaning crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. And as as almost responses, or actually I would say something like tools in your tool belt that you can use, I think two things come up. One is the four ways of knowing,
Right?
and the other is psychotechnologies.
Sure.
Can we touch on both of those?
Yeah. So part of the historical forgetting that has cut us off from wisdom is a historical process in which our cultural cognitive grammar. What I mean by that, by cultural cognitive grammar, are sort of the fundamental patterns of intelligibility, the fundamental the fundamental and both individually and culturally habitual ways in which we formulate our problems and think about things and conceive of them. And try to remember that conceive originally meant to give birth. So one of the fundamental forgettings that has happened is we have forgotten the kinds of knowing that make sense of this notion of wisdom. So the kind of knowing that we have reduced knowing to what I call propositional knowing. And this is the kind of knowing that is our grasping of facts that we assert in propositions that we believe. Like, I know that cats are mammals. There we go. There's a fact, and I'm asserting a belief. And then, of course, we've developed, and I'm a scientist, so I think this is a very, very good thing, by the way. We have developed ways of dealing with how self-deception creeps into the inferential processes by which we manipulate propositions and generate good theory, good belief. That's what the scientific and historical methods are. And I have training in both, mostly in science, but in some history as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so so I believe in science in that sense. I think that science is a great way of knowing propositionally. But as you alluded to earlier, the problem with that is that inferential propositional knowing is not, it's not identical with all of our ways of knowing. And what's really significant is that propositional knowing And we know this theoretically. It's a little bit of irony there. We know this because of the ongoing science of meaning in life. We know that those kinds of beliefs do very, very little to make your life meaningful, right? Precisely because they don't empower you to deal with these perennial problems, and they don't empower you with deepening the connections to yourself, to each other in the world. So let's go through the other kinds of knowing that actually have to do with that. So propositions are good when they're true, and that's great. But notice what we didn't have. Power. Oh, power. Well, but power matters, because you have another kind of knowing that doesn't come to fruition in truth. Its sense of realness is power. And this is knowing how. This is your procedural knowing. This is knowing how to do things, knowing how to row a boat, knowing how to walk, knowing how to talk, right? Above and beyond any proposition you utter, you need to know how to talk. It empowers you. And if you didn't have the power of speech, think about how disconnected from reality you would become in so many ways. So, right, this is your procedural knowing. It doesn't result in theories, it results in skills. When you have good know-how, you have powerful skills. And that's expertise, right? And part of more meaningful for people is if they have some sense of that kind of fulfillment of procedural knowing, in having some kind of power that they have reliable skills for interacting with themselves, with each other, and with the world. And some of those reliable skills have to specifically be skills of dealing with perennial problems.
Yep.
Okay, but whenever am I using all my skills right now? I'm a Tai Chi player, right? I have some, but I'm not using my Tai Chi skills right now. Well, maybe in some generalized sense. But many of my skills, I'm not bringing to bear. Well, how do I know which skills to apply and which skills to acquire? Well, that's based on your situational awareness. Well, what kind of knowing is that? Well, that's your perspectival knowing. That's knowing that's your salience landscaping. That's your knowing through your particular state of consciousness. This is the difference between knowing your room when you're drunk and knowing your room when you're sober, or knowing your room when you're happy and knowing your room when you're sad, right? It's what stands out for you, what's salient, what's foregrounded, what's backgrounding. It's your sense of here nowness, connectedness. And so that doesn't come to fulfillment in a sense of truth or a sense of power. It comes into fulfillment in a sense of presence. That's what we're trying to get in video games. We're trying to get that sense of presence, because that means, right, my perspectival knowing, I've got situational awareness that is allowing me to apply and acquire the skills I need. So you see how the propositional knowing depends on the procedural knowing. All the propositions depend on me knowing how to speak, right? But knowing how to speak and how to apply my other skills depends on my perspectival knowing, my situational awareness. Well, what does that depend on? Well, that depends on my participatory knowing. That depends on the fact that I'm ultimately coupled to the world in the right way. That agent-arena relationship that I was talking about earlier in reciprocal narrowing and opening, that it is taking place. That's not something I can make. Think about it, all right? Think about loneliness. When you're lonely, well, I'm not going to be lonely now. Like, you can try and sort of prove, but what's wrong there is that there isn't a proper, like, mutual fittedness between you and the world, because you need another person. So participatory knowing is, well, think about this. It's about how your biology, this is called niche construction in biology, how your biological evolution has co-shaped your environment and you, so that there are these relationships of belonging. They're called affordances in Cog Sci and Gibson. Like you have a category, I assume, food, right? So there's an apple and it affords nourishment to you. You see it as food, right? Because evolution has shaped you and that environment. Right? You have niche construction and you can grasp the apple and eat it. So it's food for you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, also notice how culture has shaped you and your environment. You're in a nice room and you're speaking English. Did you make English? Did you
Nope.
make the room you're in?
Nope.
How about the technology you're using?
None of it.
Okay. So your biology shapes you to the world and the world to you. Your culture shapes you to the world and you and right, the world to you. And now your brain, your embodied brain, in that dynamical coupling, right? It's shaping the world and you to the world. It's creating a particular configuration of agency, and it's calling out particular things as relevant and important to you. Right? This is what Wittgenstein meant when he said that even if lions could talk, I couldn't understand them, because they have a different biology. They don't have culture. They don't have language, but right? So that's participatory knowing. The participatory knowing makes all the niches, makes all the affordances. And then the perspectival knowing turns those affordances into a situation of which you are aware. That situational awareness trains and affords you applying skills in your procedural knowing. So you are empowered. And then finally, in your empowerment, you can utter particular propositions and undertake to justify and defend them in your propositional knowing. But if you think that all of that, what you are and all that you know is your propositional knowing, and that all I have to do to transform you is change your belief, which is the fundamental lie of ideology, right? Then you are not only being lied to, you are being cut off from all of this machinery. And think about how that procedural empowerment, that perspectival presence, and that participatory belonging. Think about how belonging, presence, and power are so central to your sense of meaningful existence. And if you're cut off from them, you're cut off from the wisdom that affords that kind of meaning.
Yeah. And there was a lot there. Again, this is why I want this grammar introduced to the world, because it orients you in such a beautiful way. We see this come up in a lot. There are a lot of, I feel like, common cliches that address this at some level. You know, the classic one, like talk is cheap. Like, dude, I like all the armchair sports commentators. Oh, I could do that. I could do that simply because I know that he needs to dribble the ball and go up and dunk it. That in no way means you know it deeply enough to actually do it.
That's right.
That's a huge disconnect. There's also it's the same reason why you know you should eat healthy and don't. Right? Yes. Knowledge is in no way enough for that. And then it feels to me in a way, and I may be incorrect on this, but it feels like essentially the resurgence of perennial problems, the growing force of the meaning crisis, is almost a natural result of the fact that you could say Western materialist science is so propositional. It's almost solely abstract, right? And all these four ways of knowing are almost on a spectrum of conceptual to fully embodied, right? And if your whole culture, if your whole understanding and approach to the world is entirely theoretical, you're lost in a world of abstraction and you're disconnected from the here and now. And that's why even in movies, right, when the main character is going off, what it takes is being slapped in the face, right? It's like, right here, like, get back here. And something I wanted to ask you about this, because I don't even know if that spectrum is fair, but it definitely feels that way, that it goes from conceptual to deeply embodied. And it feels
that's absolutely fair. I think that's absolutely fair.
Beautiful. And yes, they are all essential. I'm not going to discount any of them. But what I wanted to bring up is it seems like Eastern culture and Western culture have picked to set up camp at the opposing poles. It seems like Western culture is up in the propositional procedural, and Eastern philosophy has chosen to set up camp almost solely at perspectival and participatory. The example coming up for me very directly is Zen. Zen is almost mercilessly in the here and now, like, just stop conceptualizing, stop abstracting, right here, right now. You know, the wind is blowing through the trees, and that is all you need to know.
That's right.
Is that fair? Does that land?
I think that's fair. I mean, insofar as, I mean, I think that's prototypical representation of Eastern philosophy. I do
Yeah.
not know how much Asiatic and South Asiatic cultures are now oriented that way because of globalization. I
Hmm.
mean, the what you just said, um, the culture's emphasis on propositional knowing and techne, a kind of procedural knowing, technological knowing, has greatly, of course, empowered the West, whatever the West is, um, and to do, I mean, a worldwide kind of imperialism. And so, whether or not that's actually the case, because and I'm not trying to say this because I'm not trying to make a political point here, or at least that's not my focal intent. My intent is that I think versions of the meaning crisis are now becoming important in Japan,
Yeah.
in China, etc. So I, I doubt that any sort of comprehensive journey to the East, for example, like uh, um, I'm not accusing you of being overly romantic. I'm just saying that I think the meaning crisis is now becoming a global issue. That being said, so that's an important caveat. I think your central insight is exactly correct. So I was not trying to put it aside. I was trying to just situate it within
Yep.
a proper context of understanding. I think the core historical reasons that have to go back to change in the way we read and the rise of nominalism and a whole bunch of stuff I talk in the series towards belief and ideology and assertion, and that the only all that really mattered was the competition, the political competition between ideologies, and the sort of the political competition between ideologies to see who got most access to the power that science and technology was putting in our hands. And so I think, yeah, the West has gotten oriented that way. These Eastern philosophies do put a tremendous emphasis on, as you said, transformation of the perspectival and participatory. Reciprocal narrowing is a strangling of participatory knowing so that perspectival knowing loses all of its capacity for insight, right? So trying to trying to give people that non-ideological transformative capacity to perspectival and participatory knowing was definitely emphasized. The price that was paid for that emphasis, of course, was that the, the potential opening of the world that is provided by the scientific framework was also not afforded. So I love Zen. I know people who practice it, and in some ways I'm prototypical Zen because in my life I integrate a Taoist Tai Chi with a
Hmm.
Theravada Vipassana, which is sort of at least proto Chan, right? But I also don't want to give up the way what science has afforded us, because
Yep.
look at what just happened, and look who the people were. Yeah, the people who, and I did it. I taught meditation. I continued to do it during COVID, and giving people transformative ability, right, to deal with the perennial problems that are being exacerbated by the COVID crisis and the way it's making the meaning crisis like definitely. But who was also out there really making a huge difference? It's the scientists.
Yep.
They're the people who are actually giving us the tools that we need to deal with COVID. So again, you weren't saying this, and I'm not attributing it to it, but
Yep.
a kind of crypto Orientalism in which the East is, is right and pure, and we are just, the horrible. I
Yep.
think that is we should give that up. That's analogous to trying to find the one part in you that is free from dukkha, right? We
Yeah.
need what we need. And so, sorry, I'm trying to make a really central point for me, and I don't mean to be going on. We need something that properly and deeply integrates science and spirituality together. That's
Yes.
why I'm making this little speech right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's definitely worth that level of underscore because it is far too common, far too common in some spaces right now. And yeah, the easiest offhand like mantra that's come up for me is and this is by no means my creation, both and, right? If you're
Yeah,
ever in a situation where you're viewing something as either or, it's definitely not. It's probably both and.
yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
you need the complements of both, and science and spirituality is arguably one of the most powerful instances of that.
Thank you for saying that, because I think the challenge facing us, this is a way of sort of sharpening the issue of the meaning crisis. We've said, like together, and I appreciate your help on this, we've said, historical forces uh, have disarmed us in our ability to respond to perennial problems. But any attempt to address the meaning crisis has to do what we were also just talking about, I would argue. It has to reintegrate science and spirituality together in order to give us what we need to respond to the meaning crisis. Not our deepest, all of our knowings have to be put into right relationship with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, look, like it's also just historically true that early Christianity was responsible for the dissemination and exploration of a lot of science, right? This is again another kind of trope that misses the mark a little bit, which is, science is the process of cutting things up and kind of deadens the world and makes it all not as beautiful. But actually, it's not true at all. Like
No,
it makes it more beautiful. The deeper you, this is what sports is a good example, I guess. Like it's great to watch professional athletes do their thing. It's even better to have tried it yourself to see how difficult and how nuanced it is and to know what moves they're actually doing, and then to watch them do it with that level of grace. It
oh no,
actually improves it. And it's
yeah,
like,
yeah,
well, that applies to all of this happening here as well, right?
yeah.
Like it doesn't get more beautiful knowing just how nuanced atoms and molecules and nonsense and quantum physics is. It actually is more amazing. It enchants the world rather than
I,
deadens it.
I thank you for saying that. I mean, the scientific worldview doesn't give us right the, the what we need for wisdom, but it also doesn't do it like what you said. I would strengthen it and perhaps be a little bit more aggressive than you would, which is unusual because I'm usually not in that position. I would say it's unfair. Here, let me use an analogy. I think it would be unfair to criticize a particular religion if you, and I think many people do criticize it unfairly, if you didn't make some real good faith effort, no pun intended, to experience it from the inside. Like the way an anthropologist goes and does participant, notice the word, participant observation. Notice participant observation, perspectival participatory knowing, right, of another culture. If you don't do deep participant observation of a religion, you don't really, and don't get some sense, I'm not saying be converted, don't get some sense of what it is from the inside, then just criticizing it from the outside is really unfair because you missed it. It's like when you criticize a couple's relationship and but you don't know what it's like from the inside for them, right? In a typical, not a typical, in an analogous way, people who criticize science and haven't practiced it, at least done some significant good faith participant observation in it, and make all these pronouncements about rah, 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 that's unfair. It's just fundamentally unfair. I practice science, and you've heard me in our discussion criticize its deep inadequacies, but simply demonizing it. I agree with you. I think that is a fundamental mistake, and so we need to put science and spirituality into deep conversation. But that goes both ways. You just said it. We need to acknowledge how much of the scientific world is dependent. Not only the scientific world, the secular world is
Yeah.
dependent on Christianity. Paul Vanderklay has done just a whole bunch of video work, building on the work of many other people, Tom Holland, others, trying to show, how much of what we consider secular and scientific was given birth, conceived by Christianity. And so we need to, again, a foreshadowing, we need to have a deep dialogue between science and spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, actually, one point that came up was it's almost hard to judge something unless you participate in the practices that came from it.
Fully.
I think this is like a lot of people criticize Christianity, but have you ever tried like real prayer, like actually seeing what that does to your body and how you feel, and perhaps even how it ripples into your life? Same thing with a meditation practice, going to halls of worship. Like unless you've done the practices that stem from these ideas, like yeah, the ground to criticize it is very weak and very frail.
Yeah, and it reverberates backwards too. Like I, I didn't really get the Tao Te Ching until I had been practicing Tai Chi for a very long time.
Yeah, perfect example. Perfect
Yeah.
example of it. Um, I'm actually going to float this to you. There are two ways we can go right now. One is I want to dig into the meat, right? Both steal the culture and the religion that's not a religion. Do you feel that it's necessary to load in psychotexts and the ecology of practices before we do that?
Well, I mean, I could do a very quick riff because I've alluded to it many times on the ecology of practices, and psychotech won't take me that long to
Let's
try.
do it.
Okay, so the ecology of practices, you've heard me. So let's go back and maybe do a bit of a narrative biography because that gives people an access point. I was taught an ecology of practices, um, and so I was taught a meditative practice, and in meditation, it's a mindfulness practice in which you're stepping back and looking at your framing. I often use the example of like my glasses. My glasses, the way my glasses frame my vision, I look through them in the sense of by means of them and beyond them. Uh, right. I also have a mental framing that I'm always looking through and by means of. And what I can do when my glasses are dirty is I can step back and look at them to see if there's any gunk on them. That's what you're doing in meditation. You're stepping back and looking at your mental framing.
Yep.
But if all I ever did, think about it, if all I ever did was step back and look at my glasses, look at the gunk, and whoa, look, whoa, whoa. Well, how do I know if I actually have corrected my glasses? Well, I have to put them on and then look out and see if I can see more deeply and more clearly into the world. That's contemplation, right? That, contemplation, at the center of it is temple, to look out, to look into the heavens originally, is what it meant. Or it's contemplatio is the Latin word for the Greek word theoria, which means to look deeply into things, not theory, by the way. The word theory is a derivative from this more perspectival ability, right? So notice how those are in a complementary relationship. One gets me to step back and look at so that I can see distortion. One gets me to step through and look beyond, and that allows me to learn and to see what I couldn't see before. And I need both for transformation. Notice that we put these together without thinking of it in a word that we've inherited from Eckhart, breakthrough. I have to break the bad framing through into something beyond, right? Breakthrough. And so notice what I'm trying to get in is that practices have respective strengths and weaknesses, and they need to be put into a complementary relationship. The problem with those two practices, for example, is they're both very heady practices. They're taking place in your head as you're still.
Yep.
So you know what you need to complement them with? A moving practice, a mindfulness practice, like Tai Chi Chuan, that also teaches you more about the flow state. And see, that practice, though, if I'm just moving, it's hard for me to develop mindfulness in it. You see what I'm trying to show you? They have sets of strengths and weaknesses. And what you want to do is like an ecology. You want to put them into a dynamical system where they're constraining, informing, and affording each other in powerful ways. And you also need practices that bridge you, right, between different kinds of knowing. So I teach Lectio Divina, which is a way of reading, sacred reading, that helps you to bridge between the propositional and the perspectival and the participatory. Or chanting, which helps to bridge from the participatory, right, and the perspectival into the propositional, right? So you also want bridging practices. You also layer practices on top of each other. So metta, looking out, and vipassana, looking in, can be layered onto each other. The way my left and right visual fields can be layered onto each other so I can see into depth. And when I layer them onto each other, what can emerge is prajna, this non-dual awareness that is simultaneously deeply out and deeply in.
Yep.
So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put practices together into a complement relationships of complementarity, relationships that link between the kinds of knowing, and relationships that layer the practices developmentally onto each other. So I have this self-correcting, self-transforming ecology of practices. That's an ecology of practices. Is that okay?
Yeah, and just a quick bookmark, you'll notice how the end description of that sounded exactly like Dukkha and reciprocal narrowing, but in a good way, right?
Yeah,
That's also a foreshadow there. Yeah, that was perfect. And then I think if we can get psychotechnologies,
sure.
we would be
So
great.
the idea is, and this is, I think, Andy Clark has said this profoundly. Andy Clark is an example of a really important cognitive scientist and somebody who's associated with what it's called 4E cognitive science. Um, I really respect his work. I have criticisms of it as a scientist, but I recommend people reading his work. But he has a book called Natural Born Cyborgs that, because we're inherently cultural beings, we have evolved across species to fit the world to us and us to the world. Remember I was talking about that
Yeah.
mutual fittedness, participatory knowing? Well, what's an example of fitting the world to us and us to the world? Tools, like my phone, like my watch, like this mug, like this glass. It fits my hand, right? So that the world can better fit my hand. Water, I can carry around the liquid. So we have evolved, our brains have evolved to merge with tools. That's what a cyborg is, right? Now, the examples I gave were physical tools. They are designed to fit our body and extend it into the world, and also extend the world into the body, to fit the world and the body better together. But there are also psychotechnologies that are designed to fit the way our minds work, so that, right, we can extend our mind into the world and also extend the world into the mind. A classic example of this is literacy. So a psychotechnology isn't a skill because it is socially created. You didn't make literacy, I didn't make literacy, right? It is a socially standardized. This is the importance of distributed cognition. That most of our thinking is done in concert with other people, right? So literacy is a socially standardized way of formatting, information processing, the manipulation, storage, and transmission of information such that it fits my cognition well and compensates for it, empowers it. So with literacy, I can now store information outside of my own memory. I can reflect on my own cognition outside of my own consciousness. I can link my mind to yours. I can link my current mind to my future mind by writing things down. I can massively empower myself. So a psychotechnology is a socially generated, standardized way of formatting, communicating, transmitting information that is socially designed to fit cognition well, fit it generally so that it's widely disseminable amongst the population, unlike particular skills, for example, and afford a comprehensive and reliable empowerment of cognition in some way. Literacy is an example, numeracy is an example, graphing is an example, mindfulness is an example, by the way.
Yeah.
So those are psychotechnologies.
Yeah, mindfulness and graph paper were the ones that just flipped the entire switch for me. It was like, oh, this had to be invented. Like we
Yes,
actually created this. It didn't just get pulled from the ether. And
that's right.
yeah, so I think we have built a very good foundation. Let's see where our
Good.
arc has taken us, right? So we have, as a human, you have perennial problems that basically lurk under the surface like some beast in the
Always.
ocean, always threatening you.
Yeah.
I really like the analogy of the Hydra because as you address one, it
Yeah.
reorients, new ones
Yeah.
come up, and when enough heads arise, you get something like the meaning crisis. The meaning
Yes.
crisis, left unattended, can basically serve an existential threat for a tribe or for humanity at large, right? It could be people
Yeah.
just offing themselves, it could be war, it could be anything, right? Not good, not good to let continue over time. So people recognize this and they were like, okay, we need to do something about this. Um, from that, right? We had the ecology of practices that grew, and different communities would develop different ecologies of practices. They develop different
Totally.
psychotechs, all all done to help, what would you call it, make an agreement between the four ways of knowing and how they show up in relationships to themselves, to others, and the world. And through that, and to your point about the ecology, it was dynamic and self-organizing enough, and it had a feedback loop that as the threats dynamically reorganized, it could dynamically reorganize in
Yeah.
response to that. The first thing I want to say is notice how absolutely necessary that is for you as an individual and any community at large. Like, that's non-negotiable if you want to stay alive and stay sane while you're alive. So it's absolutely necessary. And so what happens when a group of people who have recognized the need for this, are trying to carry it out, come together? You know, some people give some good answers, some people share some good ideas, and then some people are like, hey, that's a really good idea, you should write that down. Or like, do you want to meet next week to talk about this? And you can see already that you have the basis of something that looks like religion. You
Yes.
have an
Yes.
organized community carrying out a set of practices that help put them in relationship with themselves, others, and the world.
Well
Awesome.
said. Yeah.
Right. So, and I think we've both tipped a hat to, I think this is something that Jordan Peterson has brought up to the surface quite well, that there is a need, there is a individual psychological and a collective institutional need for something like a religion. It
Yes.
might not have to be any of the current instantiations of it, but you really don't want to go without it, because you
Yeah.
can argue we live in a global world that is largely without it right now, right? We've moved the nuns, the people who have no real religion, are I think the largest group, and B, the largest growing group, and we are smack dab in the middle of a meaning crisis.
Yes.
Almost all
Yes.
of our crises, Jordan Hall calls this the meta crisis, right? We just have a crisis of crises, and
Yep.
we're bouncing around through it. And so it's like, we have a very visceral example of what happens when we move away from that. So it's like, okay, that experiment's probably not great. One thing I would like to speak to a little bit here is, so if we do have a need for something that looks like a religion, and actually maybe I'll bookmark this as separate from just an individual spiritual practice, because you just, you know, you can learn you can learn from your elders way faster than you can make all the mistakes yourself.
Yes.
So there's a place for religion. Why then are we looking to reinvent a new one, rather than what is wrong with the ones already in existence that have sustained for several thousand years? Like,
Yeah.
why not religion 1.0? Why now is there almost an inadequacy in them?
Yeah. That's really good. So that's that should be the culminating question, because that's going to take a lot. Um, so I mean, I've been exploring with my dear friend and colleague, who I should have mentioned earlier, Christopher Massapietro. He's very much my partner in a lot of this, and I owe a lot of this to Chris. The work we do together, and also the work on that I've done with Leo Ferraro on wisdom, for instance. So I just want to make sure that people are aware of that. But Chris and I have been exploring with Andrew Sweeney a notion I got from Carey in his book on Augustine. Um, this Latin term, inventio, is becoming central to me. Sorry, I'm on the edge of sneezing. Oh, that's why I have this odd look on my face. Um, so he wrote this book, and he was trying to talk about how Augustine afforded sort of the current sense we have of an inner self. And Augustine basically takes sort of Plotinus and St. Paul, and does this really interesting thing with his own personal sense of autobiography. And he makes the autobiographical inner self, which we all now take to be natural. But again, it's a historical phenomenon. But that's the point I want to make. Because we're inherently cultural biological beings, we need a term that that sits on both of those. So the word inventio means both to make and to discover. It's both something you're making, and so the word invention is you just make it, and the word is discovery, you just find it. But inventio is you're making it, but you're also discovering it. And so, in a sense, what I'm trying to do is do the reinventio of religion.
Awesome.
So that sense of connectedness that we've been talking about throughout, connectedness to yourself, to each other, to the world in depth, I actually use a word, religio, to talk about that. That is one of I think it's the preferred potential etymological origins for the word religion itself. The sense of binding and connectedness. So I think, and this has been deeply influenced by the work of James Carse and others, I think that the function of religions, and so I got to do this carefully. I argue that the function of religion is to give us an ecology of practices and well-vetted psychotech that will address the perennial problems and enhance religion.
Yep.
But notice that no religion actually says it that way. And instead, and again, I've been careful to note that I don't use this word pejoratively. Religions have what I would call a mythological way of trying to activate that functionality, right?
Yep.
And that mythos it depends, like all mythos, on a worldview that properly situates it and connects it to a wisdom tradition. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
A set of revolutions, right, in the past, and I mean cultural cognitive revolutions, not so much political revolutions, like the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, have sundered that mythos that we inherited from the axial age, the mythos of the two worlds and this world being less real, and the way that got solidified and I would even argue ossified in the West into this categorical difference between the natural and the supernatural, and a categorical a disconnect between them, and a categorical disconnection between faith and spirituality and reason and science as something that are deeply opposed to each other, because one is the doorway to the supernatural and the other is the doorway to the natural. Whether or not this is actually how all Christians practice or believe, I think that's a very open question. I meet many Christians, Paul Vanderklay, J.P. Marceau, Eric Cohen, Jonathan Pajot, that are in some significant way trying to, I think, reformulate that grammar in a powerful way. But regardless, that history of that mythos and its disconnect from the scientific worldview, because it's written into the grammar of that mythos, is its disconnect and its opposition. And the way science has developed a counteractive mythos, right, that's antagonistic towards religion. It politically tolerates it because that's polite, but it's ultimately antagonistic, right? And so we've got this profoundly, grotesquely stupid separation. Sorry, I don't usually use that strong, but this is the part that really bothers me, between knowledge, right, and wisdom, which is like the ancient Greeks would go, what? What is going on there, right? I think that the existing religions are so bound up, and especially Christianity, but I think Buddhism, especially Western Buddhism, because it has a two worlds mythos, and there are definitely versions of Zen, I encounter them, that are anti-scientific, anti-intellectual in a profound way, as if that, again, is the way to liberation, right? I don't think the existing religions have the capacity to bridge between science and spirituality within a pluralistic, dynamically complexifying world in a way that is needed right now to address the meaning crisis. They were crafted in a different time, within a different history, within a different mythos. Like Christianity did not grow up in pluralism. It did not grow up, right, in a scientific worldview that is massively successful, right? I can go on, and I do in this series.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to say is that the religions that we have, and I have done participatory observation in at least 3 of them deeply: Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, and they are like my family. I owe much to them, and I am respectful, and I have a loving attitude towards them. Or even Neoplatonism within the West, same thing, deeply family, deeply in love with it. But ultimately, none of those have the framework that is needed for bringing about the deep integration between science and spirituality within a pluralistic, massively, dynamically complexifying world. And this is Jordan Hall's point, right? We are facing not only complexity, but a accelerating complexification of complexity, right? I don't think the existing religions have what it takes. And I say that with love and respect for them. And I recommend that people, and I have tried to reinventio as much, instead of salvage, which I used to use, which sounds like they're broken, in some ways they are broken, but I try to reinventio from the existing religions, not just me, myself, but all these people, all these communities of practices like Rafe Kelly and all these other people that I'm meeting, right? And you've alluded to all these communities that are taking shape all around the world. I think that we can reinventio a new ecology of practices, new psychotech, and new mythos, and that's more of an artistic project, that will reintegrate science and spirituality within a pluralistic, complex, dynamically complexifying world, such that we can now address the meaning crisis. That's what I'm holding out. Now, here's what I want to say, and I say this in dialogue with people of the existing faiths. That is not a foreclosure argument. That's not a deductive argument. That's where I'm placing my bets kind of argument. It's almost like a Pascalian wager, with all due respect to Pascal, right? It's possible that Christianity or Buddhism, because they've done it before, could reorganize themselves. Like, Buddhism integrated with Taoism to become Chan, right? And then it integrated with Shinto to become Zen, right? And Neoplatonism and Christianity were able to integrate, and it was able to integrate Aristotelian science. Maybe Christianity or maybe Buddhism or maybe some, right, religion may be able to reformulate itself in such a way that it can do what I'm proposing. But I just don't see it happening collectively. I see it happening in individuals, but I don't see it happening collectively in the religions as systems of distributed cognition. So I place my bet on the religion that's not a religion, meaning by that, it is a religion that tries to be other than a religion based on a 2 worlds mythology, and is committed to new ecologies of practices, but also the reinventio of old ecologies of practices. Better said, the reinventio of ecologies of practices, both the recovering of the old and the discovering of the new, right? That's what I mean by the religion that's not a religion. The reinventio of those ecology of practices with the best we can draw from our scientific, historical, and political understanding of the world.
Wow, that was a masterpiece. There's a lot there. One thing I want to also weave into this, because I think it's necessary, and this is still formulating in me, but the importance is becoming more and more clear as I was writing that article we spoke about, and even preparing for this. Actually, in one of your, it seems like this is necessary, and you've mentioned it several times in this conversation, the profound importance culture has on the collective and on the individual. And it's actually that, culture is the culture is the technology that humans wield, right? It's this
Yes.
massive sword that the giant of humanity does stuff with.
Yeah.
So
Well said.
it is I've written that in a different article, so that wasn't off the cuff, but yeah, like it's a tool. Basically, it's a tool that the collective has,
It's a
and
cool,
that
cool.
whether we recognize it or not, we can actually wield it. It's not just some snowball falling down a mountain. Like it's a feedback
Yeah.
loop. And so, what's really important here is that culture is being shaped, and and for a long time throughout history, and arguably still now, religion was a
Yeah.
vehicle for the transformation of culture, right?
Well,
So
it's all of them though.
yeah,
I think what you've just done is beautiful. It's the means by which we can transform culture and the distributed cognition that culture runs on, but also individual cognition, but also individual character, but also the shared communitas between individuals and the group that affords distributed cognition. Like it transforms all of those.
yeah,
Like, and I don't know of any other. As I sort of talked over you, and I apologize for that. I would call culture like a tool of tools. It's kind of a meta tool.
yeah,
And it's a dynamically self-organizing adaptive meta tool that creates all the other tools by which we adapt. Chris and I make use of Geertsen's idea that culture is ultimately like religion, in, insofar as it wields culture, is ultimately a meta meaning system. It's the thing that allows us to generate all the other individual meaning systems. And so I don't see anything other than religion being, and I thank you for bringing this point up because it was a lacuna in my presentation, and it's very astute of you to point to that. I don't see anything other than religion giving us what we need in order to bring about the transformation that will be as comprehensive and as profound that is needed to deal with the meaning crisis and how the meaning crisis interacts and exacerbates the meta crisis. We don't have that. That is the tool of tools for doing that. Like I
yeah,
said, I don't think the even though, and I really want to be complimentary, even though I think a lot of the existing religions are very good tools, I don't think they're the right tool for this job. And that's why we need the religion that's not a religion. That's why I often say I'm not advocating for the French Revolution. I'm not advocating primarily for a political attempt to reorganize the system of governance and sort of the distribution of goods within society. I mean, people can vary in what they mean by the word political. That's what I take to be the meaning of a political revolution. I know there are other people like Brent Cooper have a more profound reading of political, but that's how I'm using it. I don't want something like the French Revolution. I want something like the axial revolution. I want something like what we had when we had the three R's of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution, that radically, comprehensively transform culture, cognition, character, and communitas in a deeply reciprocal and profound way.
yeah.
That's what we need right now, something like that.
Yeah, and this actually leads into something I appreciate that's coming more and more out of both you and Jordan Hall and some of the thinkers in this space, the idea of stealing the culture.
Yes,
And it's a very important term because there are two things worth looping in here. One is that a recognition that kind of global or Western culture as it stands right now is not going in a good direction for two
yes,
reasons. One, you should just listen to anything Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall say about the meta crisis and
yeah,
how, culture has downstreamed that to come into being. And also, we spoke earlier that like we are living in a meaning crisis, and that
yes,
that has come out of a culture, this
yes,
culture. And it's like, okay, so
yeah,
that's probably not ideal. The other very sneaky thing is that all the perennial problems, all the meaning crisis stuff, it's hard enough to deal with by yourself and as a community, but it can also be hijacked. It can also be
yes,
weaponized against you.
totally,
And that
totally,
is happening in so many ways, right? All
yeah,
the hypernormal stimuli, all the kind of unsubstantial food, right? And
yeah,
just like it can, all those things difficult enough when you have a fighting chance, extremely difficult when it gets weaponized against you for power and status games, right? And so there's this, the current culture, which in for many good reasons we can argue is inadequate to what we need to face, also has a momentum carrying it forward, and people who want to play that game to basically weaponize it against you, that the appropriate thing seems to become, if anyone cares about self, others, and world and the betterment of all of them, you actually have to steal the culture bottom up, right? You
Yes.
actually have to straight up just create a gravity towards you that is like, this is approachable enough, I'm flourishing enough, others are flourishing enough, we have community, our world is getting better, so much so that they're like, I just like that more, like I'm going over there. And there's a, I'm certainly in some more spiritual circles now, and there's always this hesitancy in people in this space to basically accumulate status or power or wealth, right? They view them as inherently evil, and it's like, guys, like, you are the people that should have this, right? Or
Yeah.
not should, but like, I would like to give it more to you than anyone else, and yet you don't even want to enter the game at all. But it's like, and what I've appreciated most, I've actually seen it in you a lot. Jordan Hall has always been kind of subversive, but this warrior energy of like, yo, we are about to do battle, we are going to steal the culture, we are going to rise up and do this because we need to. I need to do it for myself, my own just existential peace, and I need to do it for the world because that's what's being called. So, actually, if I can ramble one more second on that,
Please. This is beautiful.
I think something that doesn't get spoken enough about as well is this angry activist archetype. Um, something like the climate change activists are a good example. A lot of anger, a lot of justified anger.
Yeah.
Things are bad, but it's always a yelling at what you don't want the world to be like. And if you only exist in a space of not this, not this, if you actually get your way, you end up in a void because
Yeah.
you haven't actually advocated for anything. You're just advocating against stuff. And so this also why I'm so excited about the religion that's not a religion, or you also call it the post-religious faith, which I really like,
Yes.
and this notion of steal the culture, is that it actually gives people a way to orient where they're for something,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they can actually bring that. It's tangible. It's not just like, you're doing it wrong, you suck, go away. It's actually like, well, let's do this, and you can come up with points and frameworks and things, and that has by its very nature more ground to stand on. It's actually substantial.
I think it has more ground to stand on. Thank you for what you just said. I thought that was very well said, by the way. I think it's actually also a better understanding of what freedom is, which is, again, go back to Dirk breakthrough. The advocate, you're right. Well, at least a particular version of advocacy. Uh, Advocacy can degenerate, and so I'll call it a degenerative form, where, as you said, the person who's just angry, and what they want is they want freedom from X. And
Yeah.
that's right. But there is no freedom from without freedom to. The reverse is also the case. There's no freedom to without freedom from, right? You have to break the frame, but you also have to make the new frame, right? And so if people get locked into anger, and if they get locked into outrage, um, they have to be careful about that, because that's a lopsided understanding and appreciation of liberation. It's only freedom from, it's not freedom to. And secondly, they have to be careful that although they're getting locked into just the propositional, they're getting locked into what they're saying and not paying attention to how they're saying it. Because they should understand that the way modal confusion is weaponized in our culture, especially on the internet, is by making people, trying to create narratives of adversarial narratives of conflict. Because if I can get people into deeply opposing groups where they're deeply angry to each other, that will make them salient, like in a very superficial and fast way, make them very clickbaity and very soundbitey. And so, a lot of social media, the algorithms, I don't think they're, I'm not doing a conspiracy. They're not designed in this sense. There's not a cabal of people in the room smoking cigars, planning things. But they're designed to enhance sales by basically making people very impulsive and oppositional and very superficial in their appraisal. So if I can make you, like, get you outraged, that is a powerful machine to benefit the way in which I can use you to sell my products and to use you to sell my ideas. So one of the concerns I have, I share with you the concern that advocacy, when it is reduced to anger, is a lopsided understanding of liberation. And it is also a truncated fixation on what is being said rather than how it is being said. And people can fail to realize that in the very speaking of liberation, they can actually be embodying processes that are entrapping them and ensnaring them. So to give you a concrete example, people confuse speaking about a diversity of beliefs with having a belief in diversity, right? Like, well, you know, saying that we should have diversity is not the same thing as enacting diversity, right? And so you like, and you have to be careful because one doesn't automatically guarantee the other. In fact, one can actually subvert the other. Everybody's got to believe this. It's like, okay, but right. So again, I'm not trying to paint all of protest with the same brush or anything stupid like that. Trying to pick up on a particular criticism you made, and I think it's an important one. We need to bring back, right, freedom from something that's giving us a new frame, as opposed to the one we want to break. And we need to realize that anger is a very short-term response to violation, but it's not constructive. And I'm sorry, this will sound hackneyed, but you need love. You need love. You need love is the creative. You need love because love is what Fredrickson argued. You need the positive emotions. The negative emotions like anger and hate, this is some cog's eye. They engender reciprocal narrowing. Yeah. They remove cognitive flexibility. But love engenders insight and reciprocal opening. And if you only have this, you only have a reciprocal narrowing of frame breaking and the having of propositions. You're never going to get the reciprocal opening and the being free.
Yep.
And so I think we need something. My model is the model of early Christianity and Buddhism, or Stoicism. 3 examples. Or Neoplatonism. There's 4. Those are 4 I know of deeply, right? And what you have is, think about Christianity, because people, you have Paul, and you have other, and you get all of these communities, and what we have now, all of these communities with ecologies of practices, and they start to network together, and they create a new way of love, agape, and a new way, and it's not just in the head. They go out and they create the first real welfare and the first real, hospitalization and the caring of, like, that agape actually translates. And what they do is, and then the Roman Empire is up here doing all its crap. And what they do is they create all these new ecologies of practices, these new psychotechnologies, these new ways of being, and they steal the culture. They steal the culture. Same thing with Buddhism. Same thing with Stoicism, to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
That will work. That's a cultural revolution that will work. And that is what we need right now. It's not just something I'm talking about, like pointing at. This is already happening. All of these communities of practice, they're emerging all over the place. All of these gatherings, ecclesia, that's what the church meant, ecclesia, gatherings. All of these gatherings, it's all happening right now. It's already happening. All I want to do is lend whatever talented skill I have to creating a vocabulary, right? To creating a grammar, to exemplifying ecologies of practices, to teaching people what I can, to giving people access to the cog side, so that that stealing of the culture will take on a life of its own. That's the religion that's not a religion.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, that's what we're being called to do right now. And I just got to point out, it was amazing that completely spontaneously and offhand, you proved that dukkha and reciprocal narrowing is always lurking, because even the people who are fighting for good
Yeah.
reasons through anger are still um,
Yes.
that can come up. That was actually amazing. Do you have a few more minutes? We're coming up
Yes.
on time.
No, I'm enjoying this. I do. I want to say one thing now before we pass over this topic, because I was privileged, and that's the right word, although it's a contended word right now, but I don't mean in the social justice sense. I was privileged to have met Akira the Don, and he's taken,
Yes.
right? Because why am I talking about this? Because I'm talking about the reinventio of myth. And what he's doing, what Akira did with the meaning wave of steal the culture, is he's in a proper sense, and I can't do this, but he can. And he and I got to have an excellent discussion about this, creating a new mythos around this language, this way of thinking, this way of being. I mean, the meaning wave was just wonderful. It's going to reach people in a way that all of my lecturing won't, and it's going to give them imagery and embodied rhythm and music, right? And that can be shared also collectively, that will give them a mythos for this in a way I can't. So I want to just take this opportunity to once again thank Akira for doing that. I'm deeply grateful for that, because it exemplifies a potential that I said needs to be actualized, and he's actualizing it, and he's doing a really good job of it.
Yeah, shout out to Kira the Don. He is certainly no stranger to these parts. He's been on the podcast, and he actually came to do a meaning wave set for our. We hosted a digital retreat right at the beginning of COVID to kind of give some people some space, and he came to mix for us. And yeah, just in case that wasn't clear, one of Akira's latest songs is "Steal the Culture" from our man Johnny V right here, and it is stunning. It is stunning. And yeah, actually, funnily enough, that was a perfect segue, because I wanted to lead into the fact that, this has been a pretty serious conversation, right? I think justifiably so. Like, this is important. But that doesn't mean that the doing of it itself has to be strenuous and
Yeah.
disappointing and annoying, because actually I think there's a case to make where, if done properly, or the most effective way you could do this and design these things and discover these practices, is through things like serious play,
Yes.
flow state and insight cascades,
Yep.
and something like circling and dialogos.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So that's kind of the progression I want to go through. You give
Sure.
a brilliant definition of play that I think should be way more known, and just a reframing of play itself and the value of it. Could you speak to that?
So I mean, this is ultimately drawn. Um, it's drawn from a bunch of work. It's drawn from sort of Vygotsky and Winnicott, and after the point about this is a hard argument. I've got a talk out there called "Why Is Psychological Growth Impossible?" It has to do with the idea of aspiration and transformation. I'm deeply influenced. I got to meet her. She's just a wonderful thinker and person. L.A. Pauls. She literally wrote the book Transformative Experience, and I recommend her work always, and get to know Laurie's work more. But also, I have not met her, but her Agnes Callard's book Aspiration, where this whole idea of aspiration. And so play. Well, now that we've got this idea of kinds of knowing, let's go back to an instance again of where people are caught. Therapy. People go into therapy with the propositional knowledge of what they need to do.
Yep.
Right? They often know what the problem is propositionally. They can state it, right? But they don't. They're stuck. They can't get to the self and that agent arena relationship that they need to be in order to be alleviated from the loss of agency, right? That they're suffering. That's why they go into therapy. And so Well, what does the therapist do for them? Why is it problematic? Well, this goes to L.A. Poll's work, and she gives a wonderful sort of Gedanken experiment to get you and understand the difficulties here. She says, imagine your friends come to you and they give you just undeniable evidence that they can do the following. They can turn you into a vampire. And then she asks, should you do it? So how would you do it? Well, how would you think about it? Well, here's the problem. You can have all kinds of propositional knowledge, but notice that that's not the knowledge you want. You want to know what it's like to be a vampire. You want to know the perspectival knowing, right? And you want to know what's it like, what's the identity like, the agent arena participatory knowing, because your biology and your character and everything's going to be transformed. And you can't know that until you go through that transformation. The problem is, if you go through that transformation, you're no longer going to be a human being, right? So you're ignorant. You're ignorant because this is not about propositions and probabilities. It's about perspectives and participation in identities, right? You can't, you're ignorant. You don't know what it will be like. You don't know what you're missing if you don't become a vampire. But here's the other thing. You don't know what you're going to lose when you become a vampire. So you're caught, and this is Zach Stein's idea, right? You're caught between two worlds, right? It's in the title of his book, Education Between Two Worlds, right? You're caught between two worlds. So what do? Well, Laurie is really sort of interested in hammering out that problem and making people realize that you can't infer your way through it, right? It's not something you can infer your way through. And if people want a more technical presentation of that argument, look to that talk I referred to, right? But so what do we do? Well, what do you do in therapy? Well, you might say to me, well, wait, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to be a vampire. Yeah, but you know what you might become that you're not right now? You might become a parent. And right now you're not a parent. And all your propositional knowledge about being a parent isn't the perspectival and participatory knowing of being a parent. And being a kid does not give you the perspectival and participatory knowledge of being a parent. Sorry, doesn't work that way. Well, I'll just become a parent then. Well, you don't know what you're going to lose.
Yeah.
And you say, well, then I won't do it. But then you don't know what you're missing. So what do? Well, what do people do? So this is now sort of my work, and this was influenced by Winnicott. Well, people get a dog, and then they take family pictures with the dog, and they name the dog like a person, and they let the dog sleep with them, and they often get the dog as a puppy, and they have to raise it, and what are they doing? Well, they're actually enacting a symbol. The word symbolon means to join two things together. They're finding something that's similar enough to a child that they're getting a perspectival and participatory taste, but it's not fully a child. And so they can, they're not overcommitted. They haven't passed the point of no return, right? Because it's a dog. And, you can give your dog away and people don't think you're an immoral person. But if you say, you know what, this isn't working with my kid, have my kid, they go, what's wrong with you, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an example of play. We've reduced play to the sense of frivolousness, but many people, developmental psychologists, developmental biologists, right, point out that what play does is it allows us to enact symbolically, and I mean symbol in a deep sense, the perspectival and participatory aspects of the future self and the future world without having stepped out of. And so now I can actually compare them in play. And this is serious play. This is not frivolous play. This is the serious play that I engage in. That's what you do in therapy. In therapy, you seriously play. The therapist often takes on the role, right? All the roles you need, analogous to the pet, right? So you need perhaps to engage with serious play with your mom, but perhaps your mom's dead. That's my case. What do? Well, the therapist can take on the role for you, and you can seriously play with that so that something that wasn't possible for you while your mom was alive, but now might be possible. You might be able to go through a process of transformation through this serious play so that you can move to another self, another world that is other than how you are currently internalized your mother and see the world in those terms that might be harming you. Serious play is where you enact a symbol and you bring about anagoge, a reciprocal opening that can draw you in. That's what educe means, education, to draw out, can draw you into that other world. And so serious play requires that we get into what Apter calls the paratelic mode, the meta-motivational modes. We have different ways of framing our level of arousal. So when I'm when I'm doing something for the sake of an external purpose and I'm highly aroused, that means I'm frustrated. I'm not getting my goal. And so more and more arousal is bad. And then when I get my goal, oh, I relax. I've achieved my goal, and that's that wonderful, relaxing content. But notice, and I'm not trying to be graphic here, that's not sort of your attitude when you're having, like when you're, you know, I'll say it this way, when you're making love with somebody.
Yep.
Like the arousal is really good, right? The excitement. Well, you don't want it to go on forever. I'm not saying that. But now the point isn't to get to the goal state and relax afterwards. The point is you're doing something for its own sake. Yep. And therefore, the arousal isn't a frustration at not reaching your goal. The arousal now means an intensification of your involvement in the process. So that's why lovemaking is also serious play. Because what right? We can either do an activity for the sake of a goal, or we can set up an end state just for the sake of creating a play space where we can do something for its own sake. So when I'm playing, I'm doing something for its own sake. What does that have to do with what I previously said? When I'm in the paratelic state of playing, I'm trying to not have a goal. I'm trying to become a different person. I'm in the being mode, and I want to be intensely involved with the process of becoming itself. And so it's a disservice to play that our culture has reduced it to frivolous entertainment and not to think about how we keep the heritage in words of how play used to be serious. You know, you play music, or you go to see the play Hamlet, right? Those aren't, you know, I'm talking about like when you play music seriously. You're doing it for its own sake, or you're seeing the play for its own sake because it's a symbolon, an enacted participatory perspectival symbolon that can bridge you between worlds. That's also the verb in Chinese for Tai Chi. You don't do Tai Chi. You don't make Tai Chi. You play Tai Chi. So that's what serious play is. And serious play has to be the fundamental mode for the religion that's not a religion.
Yeah, that was a beautiful tie together. I'm glad your comment about Tai Chi playing came up. I was going to bring that up. Yeah, going to a symphony is a beautiful example of that. It's, the thing is done for its own sake.
Yes.
Alan Watts has a nice distinction. He's like, it's not serious, it's sincere.
Yes.
Right? Because it's not in jest, but it's not getting anywhere.
Yes.
The greatest example being if the goal of music was to get to the end of the song, eventually people would just produce the final symbols at the end. And that would be the thing. Because and it's like, well, obviously that's not true. And
or the goal is to get back to silence.
Yeah, honestly.
Just stay with your silence.
Why do it in the first place? Yeah. And that driving force is also expanded on very beautifully in Finite and Infinite Games.
Oh, I was going to mention Cars.
James Cars, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful book, highly recommended. I think, part of my criticism of the axial age mythos, and this is a criticism of Plato, who I love deeply and profoundly, is the understanding of right relationship and sacredness in terms of perfection, which are these ideas of completion and closure. And I think, I've met James, and we were at a conference together. We both loved each other's talks. I'm hoping to talk with him again, perhaps on Voices with Vervaeke. Um, and so I think James, given what I've read in The Religious Case Against Belief and Finite and Infinite Games, seeing his presentation, I think he would regard that that ethos of perfection and closure and completion and rest. Somehow, resting is resting in immortality or something like that. I think this is to just massively misframe. I think it's the having mode as opposed to the being mode. I think it's trying to turn the infinite game of religio into a finite game of sort of metaphysical transportation or something. Um,
Yep.
and even the notion of perfection and immortality. Immortality is just this really. I get that we're wired to avoid death because we're autopoietic beings, but the idea of an infinity of my existence, it strikes me as horrific.
Yep.
Because if I was immortal, I would have to be invulnerable. I'd have to be invulnerable. And one of the things that that Guy Senstock has made really clear is, genuine dialogos, genuine growth, it's inseparably bound up with vulnerability. The breaking, you have to break the frame
Yep.
if you're going to make the new frame. And so if I was invulnerable, I would be completely self-enclosed. I would not be like, what, and then to extend that, disconnection for infinity, that's hell. I don't want that,
Yep.
right? I don't want that. But you say, well, I'll make you invulnerable. I'll make you vulnerable for an infinite amount of time. Well, that's horrible too, because now I have an infinite amount of sadness and disappointment, right, and pain. Like I don't want, I think what I have, and this is a Buddhist notion of we're in the best place for enlightenment, right?
Yep.
We have better than the gods or the people in the underworld. I think what I have is exactly mortality allows me vulnerability, which affords real openness and connection, but it is made livable by the fact that it's finite in length. And so I think we've got to get, and Kars emphasizes how much infinite games require vulnerability,
Yep.
and how they're different from finite games that are trying to bring about safety and closure. And again, see the having mode. One of the things you have to have is safety, but it's modal confusion to bring that pursuit of safety into right relationship with the sacred, because and by turning it into the notion of the perfect, because that's exactly a deep kind of modal confusion. So I agree.
Yeah, and it's beautiful because like these all come together, right? The notion of the infinite game is basically making and playing a game that the maximum number of people can play for as long as possible,
Yes, and
which is
it's also a game in which the playing of the game rewrites the rules by which the game is played.
yeah, which sounds exactly like designing a dynamic, self-organizing, post-religious faith, right?
Yeah.
Those things are basically synonymous to me.
Yes,
And
I think that's exactly right. That's why I want to talk to James again.
yeah,
Uh, I think that's exactly right.
and then I think the last points I want to bring up here is, so to actually do this, to design as it goes, you need a way of surfacing insights,
Yeah,
and you need a way of doing that in a group, right? Because this is communal, and this
yeah,
leads to basically flow state, which is
yeah.
essentially, I think I first heard it uh, in your talk, that it's basically an insight cascade,
Yes,
right? You
that's
use the
right.
example of a rock climber, and then something that looks like, and I've been separate from your discussion of dialogos, I've also been watching circling and Guy Sengstock very closely, because that feels on the level of like a meta psychotech, where it's, I
It is.
can actually discover and identify the tools that are needed to, it's the system that builds a system.
Yeah, it's an infinite game. Exactly right. It's a meta psychotech. The idea that I got from, I'm grateful for it from my friend Jordan Hall, um, because you need a meta psychotech to coordinate and curate um, your and to create your ecology of practices. And again, that's not something you're going to do individually. You have to do it in distributed cognition, very much. Um, so, yeah, the, the the things like circling are, because I do participant observation in it as well, and I've gotten into you know, well, he's a good friend of mine, Guy, and you know, talking to him about it. So I got to talk to the creator in depth, and I've got to participate in it. Um, thanks, especially to people like Theodore Barrett and others. Um, and so I think it's a way of creating a flow state within distributed cognition,
Yeah.
in which we come to recover the serious play of perspectival and participatory intimacy. I think that's important. But I thought, and so I think circling is definitely part of this. But and I love him for this. Guy was receptive. This guy was ultimately trying to enact Heidegger's philosophy, right? He was receptive to a criticism, a constructive criticism. And I said, because I want to bring, and he does too, and I woke this in him. I want to bring philosophia, the cultivation of wisdom, into circling. I want to get what I see in the Platonic dialogue. I see not only philia, that perspectival and participatory, right, intimacy between the players of the Socratic dialectic, the Socratic dialogue, but I also want the Sophia. I want that intimacy awakens in them and a finding sense of an intimacy with what makes all such dialogues possible. The ground of intelligibility, the ground of virtue, right? And so what I've been doing with the work with Guy and with Chris and with Jordan, both exemplifying and then writing. Chris and I are putting together an anthology right now, getting a lot of these people to contribute chapters on inner and outer dialogues, and you know, and Peter Lindbergh's help. And Peter, I think we're doing another one tonight at the Stoa. We're getting to sort of practice this. You know, I'm trying to come up with a psychotech, which I call dialectic, which is a way of scaffolding people into this process of dialogos, which is where you get the philia of circling integrated with the aspiration to Sophia. And you get philia Sophia. And that's where you get the individual and collective transformative love for wisdom that then gives you the place from which, and it's a self-correcting dynamic that gives you the place from which, right, you can get guidance in how to curate, create, and coordinate an ecology of practice. And the ecology of practice and the dialectic dialogos are inseparably religio together. They need each other. If I try to do just the dialogue and the dialectic up here without the ecology, it's going to degenerate into just conversation, right? And having a great conversation is a good thing, but it's not going to be good. But if I just have the ecology and I don't have the meta, right, psychotech, then again, my capacity for having, you know, situating that ecology into a developmental trajectory of growth and self-correction is also going to be seriously truncated. But if I put the two together, I get something better than I get a gestalt that is greater than the sum of the parts. And so that's what dialectic and dialogos are. Dialogos is a family, is a term for a family of practices. There's what the emerged people, Thomas and Elizabeth, are doing in Europe. There's stuff that Taylor is doing, where he's doing circling and then he's trying to drop a topic into circle. Like, so dialogos refers to a family of these practices in which you engender flow within distributed cognition, but like I say, the interpersonal intimacy affords, it becomes a lens through which you then try to realize an interontological intimacy, a transformational intimacy, a serious play with the logos of being itself and the logos of intelligibility. so uh, I I think I'm offering dialectic as something that's trying to make use of the Socratic template, uh, most of the Socratic template, a little bit also from the way Jesus uses dialogue to help to be a midwife, to help people give birth to themselves. I tell you this, you must be born again. And Socrates says he's also a midwife that helps people give birth to themselves. So I'm trying to take a template from those two sages and reinventio dialectic, both the interpersonal and the intrapersonal aspects of it. That's what it is. That's what I'm trying to do. And I think it is the place where we do the most important serious play that is the dynamical ground for the ecology of practices.
Yeah, and it becomes, at least it in my head, it is so important because it also affords the reciprocal opening that we've
Yes,
touched on, right?
very much.
In disclosing myself and my truth to a group, it gets digested and reflected back to me, which opens me up, and together we, and again, this has to be a communal thing, right? And together we ride the spiral upward because
And that always engenders love, by the way. Remember we talked about not just anger but love.
yeah.
Reciprocal opening. This is Aaron's work. Aaron's the last name. Sort of mutually accelerating disclosure is how you fall in love. Not just
Mhm.
romantic or erotic love, but also friendship love. Right? That's how you fall in love with something. And what I want people to do is, of course, to fall in love with each other again, philia. But I want them also to fall in love with being and to fall in love with with Sophia again as well, because that's what they need to overcome the meaning crisis.
Yeah, beautifully said. Beautifully said. Well, that was quite the arc we took together. Um, is there anything you want to leave people with? Any asks that you have? Anything you'd like to point anyone towards?
Um, so I mean, well, obviously, I think people should take a look at Awakening for the Meaning Crisis. I think they should take a look at Voices with Vervaeke, where I'm doing the participant observation and the reinventio of dialectic and dialogos with as many people of good faith as I can. Look for the new series that's going to basically take this whole arc and right after Socrates and view this. What does it mean to bring back dialectic and dialogos in the cultivation of wisdom? And how can we take that ancient practice of dialectic and put it into fruitful dialogue with all these emerging communities of practice like circling and other things like that? So keep your eye open for After Socrates. I'm hoping that will come out later this year. COVID put a wrench in production. Um, and also look for the book that Chris and I are editing. Um, the book, which is the Inner and Outer Dialogues, which is about all that stuff you and I were just talking about. And also look for the book that Daniel Gregg and I are writing uh, on called The Cognitive Continuum, from Insight to Enlightenment, about how when you get an insight cascade, you get flow, and that when flow is put deeply into perspectival and participatory transformation, you get higher states of consciousness. And when those higher states of consciousness are put into an ecology of practices for addressing the perennial problems, you can get enlightenment. And we can go from these being terms that are wrapped in mystique and obscurity to being a realizable continuum that we can start engaging in right now, right here, right now. So keep your eye open for all of those things.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I'll have links for a lot of what came up here, any of the videos or series that we mentioned, because again, the same way I started it off, like that was an extremely pivotal series for me, very important. And I think again, very important for humans, like just period, right? If you are a human, we've addressed that you are always up against the perennial problems, and John's work does a great deal to help give you the cognitive scaffolding to address that and build a foundation for yourself. So, with all of that, thank you so much, John. This was absolutely beautiful.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. I found that this was true dialogos. I mean, if you can get to a place with another person where both people can get to a place where they couldn't get to on their own, and so that a deeper religio opens up between them, then that is, we have played the infinite game of Dialogos well. So thank you very much. That happened for me. So thank you very much for that.
As did it for me. Yeah. Thank you.